I was a little disjointed, but we're starting to get this dialogue going with Ryan's been really good, Chris McAllister has been really good about this kind of community regional thing. So that it's starting to feel like it's crossing over from cannabis to some of the other issues too. So yeah, so I think it leads to transportation stuff. So anyway, so that to me, I'm glad they were all there and talking about it.
And I'm not a part of that organization. I didn't do that once I remembered it.
Oh, okay.
So I did it a year of being the vice president.
Okay.
Now I'm not that anymore.
Okay.
I didn't want to do the two at the same
Yeah.
time. It's too much volunteer
Right.
time. But I was helping her by reaching out to you. If she ever wants one of us, she'll probably go to me
Okay.
to ask.
And I told
She's
them,
so stretched.
yeah, and I told them anything that we could do to help.
But just what we had last year, 90 people, it gets what we're doing in front of people. And this operation, you're talking about having somebody on the reach that's powerful, always saying that there was a talking environment when folks somebody do something. Because that was the only thing after walking away, just from the audience perspective. It was sort of like, who's doing it? Somebody's got to say they'll do it. And Napa did
I
it.
think Nap is going to have to take the lead on it.
Yeah.
I think they will. And Scott is a good person to get to know, and he's, I think he'll push it forward. So
It's really interesting. It's always interesting to see a perspective from different cities.
yeah, and it's fairly new. I mean, in all these years, it's just been little bubble here, little bubble there, and I think we're realizing we don't do it together. We do it. Oh, we ready? Okay, I'd like to welcome you and call to order the January 22nd special combined meeting, special joint City Council and Planning Commission meeting. And first of all, we'll have the Pledge of Allegiance. Dan, may I ask you to lead us in the pledge? To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And then we'll do the roll call.
Mayor Ellsworth,
Here?
Vice Mayor Doring, Councilmember Chateau,
Here.
Knudsen, Koberstein, Planning Chairperson Lester Hardy, which he said he's going to be a little bit late. Vice Chair is Noah. John Pont, which I believe he is not going to be here tonight. Commissioners Hale is present, and Monette is present.
Okay, now we're going to have public forum. Under California law, public comments at special meetings are limited to subjects on the agenda only. Therefore, public comment will take place during consideration of the item. Each person's comments shall be limited to 4 minutes. And now we'll move to new business, and I'm going to hand it over to the Fair Housing Napa Valley presentation and an interactive discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pablo Zatarain. I'm the Executive Director at Fair Housing Napa Valley. Thank you for having me. We've been conducting this presentation for a few years now, and what I found helpful was to relay some of our experiences and observations from working with residents across the county and what that means in terms of housing trends and patterns that we see that are affecting St. Helena residents as much as residents in the rest of the county. So to start, and I'm conscious of time here, so I may fly through a few of these slides. If you have questions, we'll leave considerable time at the end for Q&A. So to start, our three most prominent programs are Fair Housing, which is the majority of the work that we do. It's the mission of our agency, and that is all work related to investigating and, if necessary, enforcing discriminatory acts that are in violation of the Fair Housing Act. That is both federal and state fair housing laws. Within that program, we provide counseling, education, and outreach so that housing providers and residents alike are aware of their rights and responsibilities. We also conduct investigations, and when necessary, we refer meritorious cases to an attorney or other administrative entity for enforcement, such as HUD, the DFEH, or the Department of Justice. Landlord-tenant disputes is the other, and I would say the most prominent of our programs in terms of the number of clients that we see under it. And that is any housing-related issue not related to discrimination. So a 30, a 60, a 90-day notice in the case of Section 8, habitability questions in terms of substandard housing and or illegal units. It also involves education and outreach. It also involves investigations, but less so pertaining to civil rights and more so pertaining to actual housing ordinances within the county or specific city where we're investigating the case. And lastly, we provide both of those services to the mobile home parks across the county. Mobile home parks, as you may know, are governed by a different set of laws. They are enforced by the Housing and Community Development Department of California. And so because of that, we work separately on mobile home cases to make sure that all the applicable laws and regulations are still being complied with. That being said, fair housing laws do apply in mobile home parks. So our fair housing program runs almost as normal when it comes to seeing cases in those parks. And so some of the services that we provide for housing providers, review of policies and practices. So if a housing provider has questions about a term in their lease, for example, a policy that they may put into practice or are considering rent increases, especially right now following the fires in 2017, there are specific state laws prohibiting rent gouging. And so we've been working a lot with housing providers across the county to make sure that they're aware of what those limits are. 10%, by the way, from the date of the fire until May 31st, 2019. Mediation and conciliation of disputes. This occurs if there is a case where action can be taken on one side or the other, that is a tenant and or a housing provider, to resolve a matter. If it's an issue of unpaid rent that can be resolved without that tenant being evicted, we will strive and advocate hard on those types of cases, really to prevent loss of housing. And I'll go into what some of the trends are in just a bit, but based on what is happening here in the county in terms of available housing, in terms of the effects of the two disasters within the last 5 years, we see a very severe crisis in the availability of housing and in the access to available housing. And so because of that, when it's at all possible, whether it's a lease violation or some other action, if we can resolve it to the point that it keeps the tenant in question housed, that becomes our first priority, obviously within the law, but making sure that they are comfortable remaining in their housing and that the housing provider is comfortable moving forward with that tenant-landlord relationship. And lastly, training and education, as with fair housing, regarding discrimination, but also regarding rights and responsibilities as they pertain to housing providers. And so for clients or victims of discrimination, we also offer a wide array of educational resources and presentations and trainings. We review fair housing complaints to confirm and establish that they are jurisdictional as far as applying to the Fair Housing Act. We investigate complaints through a variety of ways, including testing, surveys, and witness statements and interviews. We prepare complaints for administrative enforcement and or litigation. So once a complaint is corroborated, we prepare an analysis and a written complaint that then goes to HUD or the relevant administrative entity. Conciliation and advocacy, again, as I mentioned, if a complaint can be resolved to the benefit of the client and to the satisfaction of both parties, we attempt to do that first. So litigation enforcement is really a last resort if noncompliance is really the obstacle in overcoming it. And lastly, we monitor complaints. So once a complaint has been filed, regardless of the outcome of that, we will monitor a respondent and or property to ensure that they're continuing to comply with all applicable laws and ordinances. So what you see here are the protected classes, both federally and under the state of California law. They're fairly self-explanatory. A couple of notable ones that I just want to draw attention to is disability, familial status, and ethnicity or national origin. Those are the three most prominent protected classes that we see in terms of complaints across Napa County. 55% of our complainants in the last year were Latino. national origin is or ethnicity is discrimination based on that, and so they don't fall into race because within the Latino culture, you can be African American and Latino, you can be white and Latino, and there are a number of other combinations. So race speaks more specifically to cases pertaining to African Americans, to Asians, Filipinos. We have a large Filipino population in American Canyon and Vallejo, which we also serve. Disability-related cases accounted for over a third of the cases that we saw. So between national origin and disability, you really have about 3/4 of all cases that we see in terms of fair housing-related complaints. But more importantly, disabled individuals made up over 40% of all complainants. So there is a large population of disabled households in the county. We're cognizant of that, and we strive to make sure that they are aware and have access to all of the available protections under fair housing laws. And lastly is familial status. That pertains to discrimination on the basis of the presence of children. There are many families here in Napa County, obviously, and specifically to familial status, we see a lot of cases with single parents. Low-income households across the spectrum are comprised of many members of these protected classes. And so it is within that community that we do the majority of our work. 75% of our cases were, of all cases, not just fair housing complaints, were opened by somebody that was at or below low income. So that includes very low income and extremely low income. Within the state of California, I would say that the most notable protection is source of income. Age as well, as it pertains to Napa County, as it does have an older population. But source of income is one that is looking at possibly being expanded and has been expanded in other areas to protect Section 8 clients or Section 8 voucher holders. And what that's allowed them to do is not force landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers, but simply say you, Mr. or Mrs. Landlord, cannot say I will not accept tenant A because they have a voucher. If they don't qualify for another reason, that's fine. That's perfectly within the legal business practices. But there is a large push within the state to include housing choice vouchers or Section 8 vouchers as part of those protections. It has, so far it's passed in Marin County in a number of cities, but no such plans, obviously, as of now in Napa County. And so now we move on to trends. For those of you who have been in this presentation over the last few years, you'll notice that it looks semi-familiar. I really like this model in that I'm able to show progress or not in terms of what's happening in housing across the county. What you see are updated figures, as updated as I could find them, and updated effects where applicable. So the population in Napa County continues to increase. In St. Helena, it's increasing at a slower rate. But there were also roughly 800 housing units added within the last 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, not counting 2018. And what you see is that obviously the math does not add up. There's not enough development going on across the county, not just St. Helena, to keep up with the demand for housing and to keep up with the growth of the county itself. There's also been an increase across the board in rental households. Because the housing prices are going up so much in this county and across the Bay Area, it's become harder and harder to actually purchase a home. But that trend is bucked in St. Helena, where the renter-occupied housing actually decreased by 10% between 2012 and 2017. There is a unique environment here in the city, and that forces unique strategies in addressing shortages in housing, in addressing how you work with your tenants, and especially your most vulnerable populations, and how you create equal housing opportunities for everybody in town. And so just to reinforce that point, then as of 2017, the median income in St. Helena was about 10% of the median home value within the town. So it's a combination of various factors: a small town, the amount of high-paying jobs that are available to house people in more expensive housing stock, but also then the amount of available rental housing stock, which continues to decrease across the county. And so that increased demand, along with the limited rental housing stock and/or available land, leads to increased rents and land costs. And what that has ultimately resulted in, again, across the county, but seen as well in St. Helena, is a loss of equal housing opportunities. And what I mean by that is adverse effects that aren't necessarily applied across the board or aren't impacting residents across the board, as one might think. The upsurge in no-cause evictions, meaning 60-day notices or non-renewal of leases due to rent increases, for example, is one example in the displacement of people. Illegal and substandard housing is a symptom of that same issue. And just as we saw after 2014 with the earthquake, the 2017 Napa fire complex really put an additional strain on everybody that was involved within the housing market, from tenants to property owners, and anybody that was assisting in any of those services. Not only in terms of the property losses, which affected rental housing stock either in physically lost homes or in the need for one family or household to take over a rental property because they did not have any other options, which we saw quite a bit of, but also in the loss of employment and income, which then led to problems with paying rent. And that is a problem that especially affected low-income households. And within the low-income household spectrum, again, members of protected classes, so disabled households, seniors, families with children, especially single-parent households. As I mentioned, there's a price gouging ban in the county through May 31st, 2019, meaning that rent cannot be increased by more than 10% of the rent at the time of the fires in 2017. We have seen a number of housing providers that have violated that order, and the DA in Napa, in the city of Napa, as well as the county of Napa, they are pursuing those cases criminally. So if you do find cases with that type of concern, please let us know. We'd be happy to talk to the landlord. Again, cases are not referred for enforcement unless that is deemed the only necessary way to get them in compliance. So what we do as an agency is we contact the landlord, we tell them what the law is, how they violated it, and how they can go back and address or resolve the situation. If they refuse to do so, we then look at other avenues to enforce the case. And the last bullet point there are a number of programs that came about as a result both of the fire and of the earthquake in 2014. If you'd like more information about resources for anybody that was impacted by either disaster, please let me know, and I'd be happy to help you or help them. And as an aside, my business card is at the desk there, as well as copies of the presentation. I want to make sure everybody got one. So, continuing the effects of housing trends as we see them across the county as well as in the city, low-income residents across the spectrum, including very low and extremely low, are being priced out of the region. Based on the availability of rental housing stock in the city of Napa, for example, it's under 1%. So less than 1 out of every 100 rented houses is available for tenancy right now. And this is highlighted within the city by the fact that 78.1% of St. Helena employees lived outside of the city at the time that the 2015 through 23 housing element update was released. I don't know what that figure looks like. I looked for quite some time to see if there was an update to it. But either way, it highlights the fact that there is a need for resources for a section of the community that may not have as much access to housing here as we would like. This is not to be redundant, but again, this was exacerbated by the fires in 2017, and the pricing out especially affects low-income households, as mentioned, which includes a large number of Latinos, disabled households, and senior households. And given that the populace in St. Helena, over 29%, is over the age of 62, across the county, it's similar. We have a concern that of what affordable options are available and that are left within the county. One of those is mobile home parks. And so there has been a push to to stabilize mobile home park rents. I know that within the city that was a hot topic. But from the point of view of our agency, those stabilization ordinances can go a long way in maintaining a source of housing accessible. Well, even if it is, in this case, to a senior park, it is at least keeping that housing accessible to that community where there aren't as many options. And lastly, the lack of multifamily housing. And this is a challenge here in St. Helena, but it's also a challenge across the county. There simply is not that much multifamily housing when compared with single family and detached units. And highlighted by the fact that 71% of the housing here in town is single family structures. And so effects on the community, increased commuter traffic, as mentioned. If 8 out of 10 workers live outside of your city, that will create an effect on traffic, on schools, on the communities themselves. If displacement is occurring, that's something that we've seen in the city of Napa, as well as other areas that were especially affected by the fires, Calistoga particularly. An upsurge in unlawful detainer cases heard by the court system. So generally what happens in an eviction case is one of two things. Either they haven't paid rent and they may get a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. If rent is not paid within those 3 days, an unlawful detainer is then filed in court, which begins legal eviction proceedings. The other option would be a notice to vacate, 30 or 60 days typically. If you stay past the 30th or the 60th day, respectively, you will receive an unlawful detainer, which again starts the legal eviction process. Because of the lack of options, we are finding more and more tenants willing to take their chances. And what that's creating is not only a logjam in the court system, but it's also creating a lot of undue burden on all of those tenants, where if they had accessible options, wherever that might be, whether that's in town or whether that's elsewhere, but if there were accessible housing options that they could vacate on time, or if there were programs in place. I know there are a number in the county that help with rental assistance. At the moment, it's not assisting everybody as we would like it to. And those lack of options create a lack of, really just narrow down their decision-making to need to stay or to end up housing themselves illegally in some other manner. So not reporting needed repairs in fear of retaliation by their landlord, illegally constructing additional units that they can rent and therefore help pay the rent, living with habitability issues, again, out of fear for some reprisal from their landlord. And the overcrowding was something that was occurring prior to the fires, but again, the fires really exacerbated a lot of these issues that we see within the county. And so what we would love to see is a review of how city and county resources are allocated to address those issues. We're working closely with code enforcement departments in a number of cities and with the county as well to make sure that there is active enforcement of habitability issues so that tenants aren't left in fear of retaliation, where we can step in and advocate on their behalf and ensure that they feel protected. And we're also working with local governments in a number of other ways to try to make sure that we are advocating for as much access to equal housing opportunities as possible. So, again, for those of you who have seen this presentation, you'll remember there are some photos. I'd like to give a visual aid as far as some of the issues that we see. And what you see here in this first one, and we start kind of macro and then work our way down in terms of issues within housing. But these are all landlord-tenant related issues. But what we've found is that they are addressed at different rates depending on the housing and who the property manager or owner is. This is an apartment in the city of Napa where a car drove through the wall, had an accident over the weekend. And this picture was taken a week after the accident. So there was somebody that was living in that unit for a few days before they realized that that was not legal, and they were subsequently moved out until this was repaired. But that was an example of negligence on the part of the property manager in not only expediting the repair of that unit, but in making sure that the tenant had all their due redress in terms of being relocated and in terms of any potential rent or other related issues. This is the picture of a bathroom in a house in the city of Napa. What you see in that crack is actually the outside. And so the floor was in such bad shape that the toilet was literally making the floor sag. It was a very nasty situation to be at. I was along for that site inspection. And what you see on the next picture is what the bottom of the bathroom looked like. So the lack of plumbing completely. And there were two people living in that house, had been living in that house for about 6 weeks with that issue. A disabled brother and sister. And they had contacted the landlord. The landlord had not done anything about it for over a month until we stepped in. The house was ultimately red tagged based on its condition. But that was one of the more egregious examples of habitability issues that we came across. This is an example of a mushroom or fungus growing in the house from too much exposure to moisture. You can see obviously that there's some rotting away of the drywall as well. But this is an issue that we'll see more and more of at this time of year, especially with the increased rains and after. We saw it especially after the earthquake. Once houses sort of settled, cracks in roofs and walls, those became more apparent, and the first thing to come through was the water when it came. So as that happens, it creates mold, it creates health hazards, including fungus, but much more invisible, as we'll see in just a second. This is tragically a picture of a lost mobile home. I don't believe that this was Napa fire related, but it was, it burned down nonetheless. And just as an example, between that slide and this one of our work after following disasters. So we worked after the earthquake and assisting the city of Napa, especially in doing code enforcement investigations, in helping with the tagging process, because we were already sort of familiar with how that process went. So we volunteered on a number of those days. We also ensured that tenants that were still living in a non-red tagged home, one that may have been yellow tagged and deemed safe to live in, or at least to stay in temporarily, were aware of their full rights as tenants, and especially if they had landlords that were either out of the area or not in touch following the earthquake with the initial chaos. We wanted to make sure that they felt they felt advocated, that they felt we were advocating on their behalf. This is a broken window, been boarded up. I show this because this is one of the most basic ways to violate habitability ordinances in housing. Exposure to the elements through a broken window, a door that doesn't lock, lack of heat, of electricity, of hot water. Those are all ways that a house will get red tagged by code enforcement. And there are a couple of other examples as well. But this is not uncommon, but when we see it, we, again, want to make sure that it is either being addressed, or if it's not going to be addressed, then we can get code enforcement involved to come out and issue a compliance order if need be. And this is what happens after too much rain. This was a crack in the roof that eventually became a huge leak, that eventually became a falling ceiling. And you can also see the mold spots on the top of the ceiling. So there was standing water there for quite some time. We were contacted after the fact. But in these types of situations, we counsel both the tenant and the housing provider, whether that's the manager or the owner, on what their obligations are to resolve the situation. If ever any of this damage is tenant caused, we review whether or not it's sufficient or justified for some sort of displacement, but typically we advocate very strongly against that and seek to find other ways. If the tenant is responsible, they will of course have to pay, but in those types of cases we would hope that the housing provider was willing to work with them and with us to ensure that that plan gets seen through. In this type of case where it's not necessarily due to anybody's fault, but maybe it was an unseen issue, it's red tag nonetheless. The housing provider still has a responsibility to relocate them until the housing is brought back to habitability. And this is another issue of a lot of mold found in a house. This was a windowsill, and as you'll see, it's almost completely black. It's not uncommon, and especially in areas up valley, for us to find these types of cases of mold. The only reason I show this, the only time a carpet can be considered as part of a habitability issue is if it presents a tripping hazard. So in this case, the carpet was opened. There was a way for people to fall if they came in contact with it. That was a quick Band-Aid to the situation, but eventually that needed to be addressed by the housing provider. And lack of hot water. As mundane as that seems, if that's the only working sink in the house or within that tenant's use of the house, then we need to make sure that that hot water works or it presents a problem for habitability issues. There are other ways. We've found houses with no water heaters before. We've found other examples of a lack of hot water, but this one is fairly straightforward. If they don't have it, then it needs to be addressed as soon as possible. And especially at this time of year, any lack of heat or lack of hot water is especially concerning. And again, mundane as it may seem, but if that's the only smoke and or CO2 detector in the household, that presents a significant risk to any resident living there. So we want to make sure that they are not only functional, but have batteries and everything needed to keep them up to date. So, options for affordable housing. There are options within the county, but there is a lot more demand than there is supply. And so what we find are a number of different programs, each of which assists the issue, but is not the sole answer. For example, the Housing Authority of the City of Napa has the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but they also have over 6 years of wait time. And near 10,000 residents on the wait list. They have a home share program, but that is limited to single tenant households generally, and is also sort of at the discretion of the home share host, so to speak, whoever owns the home that is then providing room to share it within it. So that limits opportunities for families, that limits opportunities for disabled household, for example, that might need a caretaker. And so it presents a few limitations in that area. Mobile homes, as I mentioned, are one of the last truly affordable options within the county. But there are also not a lot of units across the county to house all of the low-income households that reside here. So rent stabilization is a way to maintain that accessibility. But it's also at the discretion of a few different powers. The Napa Valley Community Housing, they also have a number of affordable properties, including one here in St. Helena, but they have a wait list as well, over 600 residents the last time I checked with them. And local affordable housing advocates and developers, our town, St. Helena, being one of them, Calistoga Affordable Housing, another, any group that is advocating or is developing successful implementation of affordable housing strategies, we would love to work with them, and we are actively seeking them out. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Okay. So in looking at solutions and remedies to address some of the housing trends we just discussed, I went back and reviewed the housing element goals. Their continued implementation would go a long way towards, at the very least, actively addressing some of the issues, but there is more that can be done in terms of meeting the RHNA numbers, in terms of continued construction and development of additional units for low to moderate income households. And that's a countywide effort. That's going to take collaboration among all jurisdictions, not just the city of St. Helena, but among the county as well, among the other local governments within the county, and community stakeholders. So our town, St. Helena, Calistoga Affordable Housing, there are a number of agencies that advocate for and work towards the development of affordable housing, and we want to work with them and do our part to support them. And in, again, looking at possible solutions, stabilizing, maintaining, and improving access to housing, very broad, easier said than done, obviously, but as I mentioned, that can start with strong enforcement of code ordinances and building ordinances, streamlined processes for development and construction of affordable housing, including permitting, Spreading awareness of existing programs within the city. We try to promote these programs as much as possible and provide referral, but what that also does is it feeds to the wait list of these programs. So the development of additional programs or other types of assistance to access, not so much monetary assistance, but programs that create assistance to access to affordable housing would go a long way in definitely not solving, but addressing the housing crisis. And lastly, looking at other strategies for addressing the shortage in rental housing. We mentioned home sharing, room sharing, but also micro homes, modular homes. Those are all options. The use of ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units. So those are the grandmother units in the back of homes that you might find. Those are all ways that collaboratively or comprehensively can begin to address some of the crisis. And I'll touch on affirmatively furthering fair housing was a national obligation under the Obama administration to actively work in promoting equal housing opportunities. The Trump administration has deprioritized it, although it is being considered as a state mandate within the state of California. HCD is looking to strengthen some of its enforcement authorities. And that may come under those HCD guidelines, or it may be operated directly by the state attorney general. But what affirmatively furthering fair housing means is that jurisdictions that, in the case of the federal government, that received federal subsidies were taking meaningful actions to promote inclusive communities and tear down barriers to equal housing opportunities and such as segregation and discrimination. And as I've mentioned before, this AFFH, as it's called, and the housing crisis in Napa are tied together in the terms of who is impacted most by this crisis. And I will just reiterate, as I've mentioned a number of times already, the largest groups that we see within Napa are families with children, disabled households and seniors, and the Latino community. So anything that we could do to address the housing crisis for them would go a long way towards stabilizing the housing market in the county. Thank you very much. And thank you. I just wanted to leave enough time for questions, comments, feedback. Please feel free. Yes.
Well, this is just an information question. On page 2, on the state of California list for protected classes, it says arbitrary characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
So it's exactly what it sounds like, which is very, very broad and hard to apply. But the example I tend to use is if we could corroborate, for example, that a landlord did not rent to people with tattoos. So they were not, tattoos are not protected by civil right law. But if we could prove through investigations that any time the landlord spotted a tattoo, he would deny them housing, we could pursue a complaint under arbitrary characteristics. It's not very common. It's meant as a catch-all, but because of how broad it is, it's very hard to bring a case under that class.
And I also wanted to know, do you have litigators on your staff? On number 4, talks about that you enforce or litigate rights of landlords.
No, we refer for enforcement and litigation. So we have attorneys on staff. They are not practicing attorneys, but we have a network of civil rights attorneys and fair housing lawyers that do take these cases. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you know of any strategies to entice the owner to be able to rent those micro units to the people that need it instead of using it as an office, or what people might do?
Of a specific strategy, I don't. I've heard of a couple. There are incentives in terms of taxes, I believe, in terms of the permitting process. It would be really community specific, I think, depending on what would work best and what would make sense and what would have the most community buy-in, really. How can you entice your community or incentivize your community to take up that strategy? I think that would take that type of research. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have sort of a two-part question. First of all, where is your data from
Census data. Census data and the most recent updates on the American Community Survey.
And then the other thing that I think is interesting is, for example, a lot of commerce is focused in St. Helena compared to its near neighbors, say Deer Park or Angling. Angling has the college, Deer Park has the hospital. To get from Deer Park or Angling to St. Helena is often faster than going across Napa if you're in North Napa trying to go to South Napa. That can take quite a bit of time. In your assessment of housing, if you look at those sorts of things, it's outside of our city limits, but in a way, housing does support, the things that are going on.
Absolutely, and I think an in-depth look at any type of question along those lines would require looking at what does that 78% mean? What is it made up of? How many people live in nearby communities where that number may seem higher than it should? In looking at the data, that number stuck out to me just in terms of how high it was. But it can certainly explain a lot, and I mean, you can make data really say whatever you want it to say depending on how you spin it. That certainly wasn't my intention, but that little tidbit adds some context that I think is valuable. Thank you.
Question about the price gouging ban.
Mm-hmm.
That looks like it was about an 18-month period of time that was established, perhaps by a directive of the governor.
Right.
And the question is that representative of any time there's a disaster, is it always 18 months, or is this a case-by-case basis? And if it is, are there any discussions about a possible extension of that?
So originally the ban was for a year. So it was through October of last year. It was then extended until December. And following the LA fires was re-extended. And we actually advocated to Senator Bill Dodd to make sure that Napa County was among those disaster declared areas that received the extension. Solano County, which had been a part of previous gouging bans, is not part of this extension, for example. So there were two extensions given, the most recent one in December for up until the end of May. Yeah. What's that? To be seen, I think. I think it's a statement to the housing crisis across the state, not just in the Bay Area, but I think Bay Area counties are acutely feeling it just based on the pre-existing crisis that was already present. And if you look at a county, at Santa Rosa, for example, which is very close to Calistoga, they lost 5% of their housing stock in the fires. So those residents have to go somewhere. It may be Calistoga, it may be Solano County, it may be somewhere else, but they're going to have to try to rebuild somewhere. And so what we see is that trickle-down effect. Both North Bay counties affected. They can either move east, they may move north up into Northern California, or they may move elsewhere, depending on what opportunities they have available to them through friends or family or otherwise. Yes?
I'm trying to understand how the price gouging applies. If the tenant leaves, is the unit still subject to the rent that was in effect before, or does the landlord then have an opportunity?
The only exception that we've been told by the state AG to this ban is if a tenant leaves and they do significant remodeling of the property, then they can increase it to what might be considered market. So I'll give you an example. There was a home in Napa that was up for rent at the time of the fires, $2,800, I think, a month. 4-bedroom house, so it was a very large house. Fires occurred. A couple contacted them to rent it. At that point, it was on the market for $6,700. And they didn't know. They were desperate for housing, so they took the rental. And then later, were on Craigslist for some other reason, saw the original ad, and realized that she had more than doubled the rent. That's the type of case that we had referred to the DA. So it's that egregiousness. Anything that's minor, if it's 15 or 20%, and we can speak with the landlord If they've already charged the tenant, they might forgive a bit of rent on the next month to get everything evened out. Those types of cases are happening fairly commonly, and we're able to resolve them for the most part. But in those egregious types of cases, and including cases where the house is vacant but being re-rented, we are actively monitoring it.
I have a follow-up question, yeah. Does it apply to ground rents in mobile home parks?
As far as I know, it applies to all rents. Any rental housing falls under that ban. Yes.
What would you need to see to have another conversation with Senator Dodd for another extension?
Well, I think the extension is what our number one concern is, and that's going to happen eventually. I mean, they can't keep extending it, but we get right before the expiration, the last two times before it was extended, right before the expiration of the bans, we were getting calls from housing providers saying, okay, so you're telling me right now I can only increase it this much, but I think one of the other deadlines was December 4th. But on December 5th, I can increase it 20%. And so we see the clear intention there. And so our concern is not so much to keep the ban in place as much as to make sure that when the ban is lifted, that there are rational increases, if there are any, to be implemented by landlords. It's in such a way that they don't bring on a mass displacement across the county of residents that have enjoyed, or not enjoyed, but have been given the right to controlled rent, so to speak, following the disaster. Once that's lifted, and it's inevitable, our largest concern is going to be the displacement, and that's why we've prioritized keeping tenants housed as highly as we have. We're not looking for violations necessarily of it. Let me rephrase that. We're always looking for violations of fair housing laws, but our first priority is to make sure that we can keep that tenant housed, because we realize how risky of a situation it might be if they're displaced.
So there's no way to know until after it is.
No, and frankly, I didn't expect this last extension. I think it came about as a result of the fires that happened afterwards, both in Paradise and in LA, and the continuing housing crisis here. Senator Dodd was able to advocate on our behalf and say there's a continuing crisis. Napa needs the ban in place for now, but eventually that will pass. Yes.
On slide 24, it talks about additional solutions, micro homes being one. Are there any specific programs or model developments that you can show us how that works?
Not that come to mind immediately. I'd be happy to discuss it with you and or a group from here from town after having done some research, definitely. Well, thank you guys.